For today's video, we'll be looking at one of the more famous Japanese warships, especially for a ship that never saw anything approaching proper combat. After all, Shinano is famous for other reasons, like being the final member of the Yamato class, even though she was converted. A conversion that made sense at the time, but has become something of a sticking point in following years. And a conversion that ended up going to waste as the ship was sunk before she was complete. A sinking that has also become somewhat infamous in later years. All of this is true, of course. Still, Shinano is worth looking at as a what might have been case, in addition to her sinking. Let's start with the background. Shinano began her life as Warship Number 110, the third member of the Yamato-class battleships, Japan's ultimate expression in battleship design. However, the story of this ship is somewhat similar to that of the final pair of Richelieu-class ships that I recently covered. Yamato was laid down in November 1937, while Musashi was laid down in March 1938. Shinano wasn't laid down until May 4th, 1940, almost 3 years after the first ship and only a few months before her sister ships were launched. This delay was partially down to the chosen shipbuilder, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, which had to build an entirely new dry dock number 6, just to build this monster of a battleship. Similarly, there was a new hull plate workshop built at the same time. This understandably slowed down construction. If you watch my video on the French ships, you can probably guess where this is going. The Japanese, having to wait to build the ship anyway, modified the design a fair bit. There were two major changes to Warship Number 110 compared to her sisters: armor protection and the secondary battery. In the case of the armor, this was slightly thinned down in comparison to the older ship. Mind you, not to any drastic extent. The difference was very slight. On Warship Number 110, this was 15.7 inches or 400 millimeters. On Yamato, it was 16.1 inches or 410 millimeters for the main belt. Deck armor saw even less of a change, 7.5 inches, 190 millimeters, compared to 7.9 inches or 200 millimeters. Similarly, the turrets lost about 20 millimeters in thickness across the board compared to the older ship. Axis and neutral battleships cites this reduction, leading to an extension of the triple bottom, along with better protection for the superstructure. With that rounding off the armor, let's move on to the secondary battery. This was the other major change to Warship Number 110. While the triple 6-inch, 152mm turrets remained the same, the dual-purpose guns would be changed on a 1-to-1 basis. On Yamato, this was 6 twin mounts of the 5-inch, 127mm gun, carried 3 to a side around the superstructure. On Warship Number 110, those mounts were replaced, with 6 twin mounts of the newer 100mm gun famously used on the Akizuki-class destroyer. This was a reduction in surface firepower, but a vast improvement in anti-aircraft firepower. I'll link my video on the 100mm gun for those curious. Beyond these changes, the design remained mostly the same. Even the predicted tonnage was more or less the same at around 64,000 tons standard, according to warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And of course, the main battery was still 3 triple turrets carrying 3 18.1-inch 46cm guns each. with a speed coming out to 27 knots on 150,000 shaft horsepower. All of that being said, though, this design wasn't actually built. Not entirely. Warship 110, by now named Shinano, was laid down on May 4th, 1940. Her construction progressed at a decent enough pace, at least until late 1941, in the same secrecy as her sister ships, leading to no surviving photographs of the ship under construction. Or if there are surviving photos, they haven't turned up. However, by late 1941, things changed rather drastically. The Japanese didn't expect the ship to be completed until around 1945, maybe late 1944 at absolute best. That was a lot of resources, from raw materials to dockyard workers, tied up in one ship. A ship that seemed a bit unnecessary in the face of the dramatic aircraft carrier successes of the early war. From Pearl Harbor to Darwin, and the sinking of Force Z by land-based bombers. While the ship was seen as a bit of a white elephant, the massive dock was something the Japanese would have really liked to put to use. They had two options at this point: scrap the ship in place, or complete her enough to launch and clear the dry dock, with the final fate of the ship something to solve at a later point. As it turned out, the Japanese went with the second option. The workforce was reduced a bit, but Shinano was expected to launch in 1942. All well and good until the Kido Butai was smacked around at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Suddenly, the Japanese were faced with a bit of a problem. 4 out of 6 fleet carriers were lost in one battle. This sudden gap in their forces led to several schemes to rapidly increase carrier numbers. The most visible of these being the battle carrier conversions of Issei and Hyuga. But Shinano was also looked at as an option for conversion. That said, it wouldn't be conversion to a proper fleet carrier. You see, the Japanese still saw themselves with a good group of proper carriers. Shokaku and Zuikaku, arguably the finest Japanese aircraft carriers, remained intact. The new Taiho was well on her way to completion. And then there were the Unryus, scheduled to begin construction by the end of 1942. In addition, there were the various light carriers and the slow but very capable conversions Hio and Junyo. This resulted in an interesting situation. On the one hand, you can see desperation in the conversion of the Isseis, which were even considered for a full carrier conversion before it became apparent that would take too much time and too many resources. On the other hand, you have Shinano, which was, well, not made into a proper fleet carrier, despite that being a possibility. Instead, the 45% complete hull would be turned into a massive support carrier. As I like to joke, HMS Unicorn after eating too many Wagyu steaks. Although Unicorn was more intended for repairing and supplying aircraft, not strictly carrying spares. Shinano, on the other hand, was designed to carry a lot of spare aircraft. As envisioned in Japanese doctrine post-Midway, Shinano would support the frontline fleet. Spare aircraft would be taken off the main fleet carriers, which would dedicate themselves entirely to carrying active aircraft. Meanwhile, Shinano would sail along with spares and the facilities to repair and rearm them. In this way, the Japanese could have a stronger strike force and a well-protected, mobile backup stock of aircraft. A good idea with the massive attrition rate Japanese carriers were suffering. Or so the theory went anyway. With this plan in mind, Shinano began conversion in September of 1942. The predicted completion date remained roughly 1945, at which point the ship would have a brand new fleet of carriers to support. Except that also wouldn't happen, as we'll see. As for the conversion itself, this involved removing all the features of a battleship. Gone were the turrets and the original superstructure, though these hadn't even been fitted. Instead, a massive hangar and flight deck was built up over the existing hull. A flight deck that was 840 feet, 256 meters long, and 131 feet, 40 meters wide. In typical Japanese fashion, it overhung the hull and was supported by pillars. An island, modeled on Taiho, was fitted on the starboard side, with the funnel integrated into it, and 2 elevators were fitted to the flight deck. Lessons from the losses of Japanese carriers were also incorporated into the conversion. First and foremost, an armored flight deck intended to resist 1,000-pound bombs. In addition, the ship had a largely open hangar in the event jettisoning burning aircraft proved necessary, although shutters were fitted to provide protection from splinter damage or the weather. On top of this, another loss while under construction occurred. Taiho lost to gasoline fumes, indicated a potential vulnerability. In response, the Japanese went to great effort to improve Shinano. The first thing they did was surround the aviation fuel tanks by 2,400 metric tons of concrete, in the hopes of avoiding splinter damage. While the ship also had improved ventilation and firefighting equipment fitted. Armor protection beyond this point is something of an interesting mix. Exactly how much armor the ship had varies between sources. I've seen it cited that she had her original belt armor over the magazines where it was already installed. I've also seen the armor thinned down to 8 inches, or even further to somewhere between 6 and 7. This is another one of those areas where records aren't great, and different authors will cite different numbers. As for defensive weaponry, this consisted of 8 twin 5-inch 127mm mounts, not the intended 100mm guns. That's not surprising because the Japanese had issues building enough of those weapons. The rest of the defensive weaponry beyond that was over 100 of the 25mm guns and 12 28-barrel rocket launchers of dubious utility. The power plant, meanwhile, remained the same, 150,000 shaft horsepower for a speed of 27 knots, although the slightly lighter displacement of around 70,700 tons might have made for a higher speed. All of this supported an air wing of 42 aircraft, 18 fighters, 18 dive bombers, and 6 scout aircraft. That wouldn't be bad for a conversion if Shinano weren't so utterly massive, the largest aircraft carrier built until the Forrestal-class supercarrier. You can also see this in the ship carrying over 100 crated-up spares. That could, theoretically, have been put to use by Shinano herself. Either way, with the design finished, Shinano continued on her construction. After the losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, construction was sped up. It was too late to use her as a proper fleet carrier, but she was still a flight deck. A very large flight deck. And the Japanese planned to finish the ship in October 1944 instead of early 1945. They were also worried about bombing raids hitting the ship. Shinano would be launched on October 8, 1944, with the ship suffering a mishap in the process. the dock flooded improperly and Shinano slammed bow first into her dry dock. This damage required repairs that lasted until October 26th. The ship would formally be commissioned on November 19th, 1944, after those repairs were completed, with a B-29 overflying the dock the very same day, giving us one of only 3 photos known to exist of the ship. Thoroughly spooked by this, the Japanese ordered the ship to sail for Kure by the end of November to finish fitting out. The ship's captain, Toshio Abe, did not enjoy the idea. Shinano's watertight integrity was lacking. Most of the watertight doors weren't fitted, and a lot of compartments had openings for cables or ducts or pipes. Even the firefighting system wasn't complete. Still, this is the Imperial Japanese Navy. Orders were not to be ignored. Shinano set sail on November 28, 1944, with 3 destroyers, Izokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze, for escort. Shinano carried no aircraft, unsurprisingly. By this point of the war, the Japanese couldn't even supply planes and pilots to their proper fleet carriers, like Amagi and Katsuragi. Instead, the ship carried 6 Shinyo kamikaze boats and 50 Oka flying bombs. As Shinano set sail at around 20 knots, the ship was spotted soon into her voyage by the submarine USS Archerfish. Commander Joseph Enright tracked Shinano on radar and set about trailing the ship. Shinano, for her part, spotted the submarine on radar, and eventually visually as well. Concerned about a potential wolf pack, Abe didn't send his escorts against Archerfish, thinking she was a decoy. The sub continued to track the carrier, until Shinano, around 3 a.m. on November 29th, sailed directly at Archerfish while zigzagging. When she turned to continue the maneuver, it gave a flat broadside for the submarine. 6 torpedoes were promptly launched, with 4 of them hitting. This damage might have been survivable had the ship been complete. But she wasn't. Shinano quickly developed a list and would struggle along until around 11 a.m. Attempts to counterflood or tow the vessel failed as the open interior progressively flooded. Shinano finally capsized and sank, taking 1,435 men with her. 1,080 were picked up by the escorts. Her sinking was, in a lot of ways, an avoidable one. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they failed to avoid it. Meanwhile, Enright would have to wait until after the war to receive a Navy Cross for sinking the largest vessel ever sent down by a submarine. He was at first credited with sinking a Hio based on his sketch. Only after the war was this rectified. As for Shinano, her wreck hasn't been found. So close to Japan, you need the Japanese government to support any searches. To my knowledge, they haven't, leaving what might be the closest thing to an intact Yamato silently rusting away out of sight. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.